Hi, everyone. It is our pleasure to welcome you here today to our clinical conversations with Dr. Porges and Kim Barthel. Just going to give some time for everyone to come in. As you do, just get oriented, get settled. We have very, very rich content for you guys today, and it is our pleasure to be sharing it with you. And as you guys get settled and as you start coming in, and I just invite you to invite your whole self here and to be able to receive the things that are offered. And I believe it's going to be a truly lovely conversation. And just as a housekeeping item, this is not a question and answer format, but if you do have questions, you are welcome to put them in the chat. And one of our lovely program consultants will be there ready for your questions and provide an answer or some direction. Okay, just a couple more minutes. I see we have good mornings from Turkey, from Vancouver, from New York. Welcome, everyone. Wow. I don't know if you two can see the chat. There is an incredible amount of real estate covered. Okay, just about one more minute. And again, if you're just now joining, I just welcome you to come here, be present. You get a little oriented. Like I said, this isn't a question and answer format, but one of our program consultants will be answering questions if you want to put them in the chat. So go ahead and use that resource if it's helpful to you. And this will also be recorded. And so you can guarantee that it will be sent to your email if you registered. Okay. We have just under 500 people present, which is incredible, very exciting. And I think we'll go ahead and get started if that sounds good to you. Awesome. My name is Leah Dawang, and I am your host. I serve as Unite's Strategic Partnership Manager, and it is a pleasure to be here. I would love to introduce our speakers. First, Dr. Porges, it's so great to have you here. It's my pleasure to introduce you. And in addition to being an author, professor, and acclaimed researcher, Dr. Porges also serves as Unite ILS's Chief Scientific Advisor and is the creator of both the polyvagal theory and the Safe and Sound protocol. Dr. Porges, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Leah. As we mature, as the years roll by, we start realizing that the most important thing is not our credentials that we normally would think are important, but whether people are accepting of you, whether you feel connected to other people, whether it's how you relate to others. So what I often like to say is that the best introduction for me is that he is such and such a researcher, but he has a heart like a clinician. And that makes me feel very welcomed. So thank you, Leah.
Absolutely. And with that, it's also a great joy of mine, we welcome Kim Barthel. She's passionate about neurobiology, mental health, and understanding complex behavior. Kim is an occupational therapist extraordinaire, author and multidisciplinary teacher, whose mission is to support the conscious evolution of the human spirit. Kim, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for this incredible opportunity for this rich conversation.
And as we get started, before we get started, I'd like to name our intention and invite all who are listening to share it. With the immense amount of division ravaging our world today, it is imperative and our great honor to seek to build a bridge amongst the disciplines of the helping and healing communities. The truth is, we and those we serve are intricate, multifaceted beings, and an integrative approach, one that says it will take all perspectives and all disciplines to heal fully, is the approach with the greatest outcomes. It's in this conversation we will continue building that bridge. Let's begin, shall we? I'm very, very, very excited. And I have a question to get the ball rolling, and then we'll see where we go from there. And if that sounds good to you both. And Dr. Porges, I love that you said that, and it's so true. Both of you are so interdisciplinary. And as a starting question, I'm wondering what aspects of both your own and each other's approaches would you consider to be vital to the way that you engage?
Well, I would start off by trying to remind everyone that, we are a species that is basically a social species, and we evolved from other mammals that were social, but mammals evolved from asocial species. And this transition from asociality to sociality enabled mammals, and especially humans, to connect and to co-regulate with one another. So when you talk about divisiveness, what you're really talking about is being in a physiological state that supports defense or threat. So there is, when you use the term multidisciplinary, there's a common underlying core. And that is, if we can feel safe, if we can convince our neurophysiology, our body, that we're safe, then the core of what it is to be a human can be expressed. But we live in a world, and I'm going to, in a sense, go into a little bit of a monologue script for a moment. But what we live in a world that is a heavily evaluative world. And we now have to translate, what does evaluation do to our nervous system? We interpret it as threat. And everything in our world on almost a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week cycle is about evaluation or threat. And we need to, in a sense, understand that the only way that we mitigate or we downregulate those threat reactions, which affect mental health, obviously, but also affect our physiology, they create those so-called comorbidities, which are not comorbidities. What we've done is we've disrupted our neuroregulation of our autonomic nervous system. We have to respect the fact that through the evolutionary history of humanity, sociality was the way in which we downregulated threat. So our ability to interact with each other, to detect cues of safety, is not merely an option of a psychological domain. It's a neuromodulator. It's elevated to the level of changing our physiology. And those of you who use safe and sound protocol functionally have seen this work. It's, in a sense, using cues of safety along the acoustic channel to tell the nervous system that you're safe for a moment or safe for a while, and then what emerges. And what emerges is spontaneous interaction and self-healing.
Leah, before I jump in, I want to start by saying that I want to acknowledge, in the spirit of reconciliation for the colonial trauma of Canada, that I wish to acknowledge the land that I'm speaking from today, the unceded and ancestral territory of the Wu-Saanich and the Coast Salish people of Saanich, British Columbia. And I begin that way as a form of connection from that space of hope that through reconnection, as Dr. Porges just spoke about, that healing is possible. How could we not need each other as disciplines? Your question of what do we bring to the table that supports each other? When I sit with that question inside of me, I don't know how we cannot. It's like, it's not even a right hand or a left hand. It's a holism, not one discipline or one thought process has the whole picture. Individual humans are so complex, and there isn't one of us that would have the answer for all. So polyvagal informed thinking is a offering to multiple disciplines, to humanity, really. Let's just say that, rather than clinicians, as a way of reminding us what we have inside of us to connect.
Kim, I want to, in a sense, not only reward, I want to give you a hug for those statements, but and connect. But what we're really saying is the same thing, is that the beauty of what humanity is comes out when our bodies are safe and our nervous system is not under threat. The kind of the metaphor that I use is that, you know, the core of humanity is just marvelous. It's benevolent, it's generous, it's compassionate. But few people can express their core because they're covered with wrappers of concern about what others think of them and what they need to do to survive. And even the pandemic carries with it this chronic sense of threat and fear. And when you opened about the history upon whose land we are living our lives, this, you know, the United States is not free of that history. And there's the real comment on all that is that as a species, we're a traumatized species that doesn't remember its own history. But if you're traumatized, what is your adaptive reaction? Numbness and amnesia. And part of that re-embodiment is this acknowledgement of who you are relative to other, and, you know, in a sense, where you are in time and space. And but before we move into that, we have to literally be prepared to realize there's a lot of sadness, a lot of pain that gets uncovered. And we have to be extremely careful that when that gets uncovered, it doesn't trigger in us a sense of shame and guilt, but really stimulates us to help others connect and feel safe in the present time and space.
One of the beautiful things that you've just said, and Leah was reminding me that I said this the other day in a conversation, is that the Safe and Sound protocol, although the work that it offers all by itself is magnificent, but in the context of compassionate, connected, and available engagement, the work is embodied. And that's, I think, what you're saying, is that when we connect to a defense, that when we tap into, as Doreen Hunt would say, when the door opens and we step
we
into,
better be there. We better be
there.
there. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have seen this when I started to develop it. I saw children on spectrum just suddenly switch and be engaging, and their parents being unaware of those engagements. And that then triggered frustration and anger in a child who was now opening up. And it's like, you better be prepared. You better understand that when your child becomes engaging, they're going to become demanding. And they're going to be interactive because they're moving towards you. Although in certain homes, as we all know, that when you deal with challenged children, they're challenged homes, and often the families don't have the psychological resources to spend with the child. And so giving the child a toy and sitting in the corner of the room is functionally easier for the family to survive. And it's not a criticism of the family. It's saying that you have to evaluate the demands and you have to, in a sense, understand what resources you need. Safe and sound protocol was never meant to be a standalone intervention. It was meant to be, I'm going to use a kind of a metaphor, a state shifter. It was supposed to open that door. It was supposed to give the body a feeling of what it is to be available. But you better be prepared. If your body is available, if the other person isn't, it's going to create a conflict. It's not going to be what you want. And we've seen this. There's a story that I got an email from a woman whose son had gone through SSP and was doing really well. And 6 months later, she decided to do it again. And she walks into the clinic room where he's finishing up the last hour on the 5th day. And the child goes into tantrum. Now, she was a very insightful person, and she reflected, why would this happen? And what had happened was she was talking to a physician who really upset her. And she walked into the room. Now, you can imagine if someone said the face was flat, and so her availability, that child's neuroception was turned on to pick up cues of engagement and reciprocity, and it was violated. And it was like my good friend Ed Tronick created the still face paradigm. And that is where you basically are engaging the baby, and then you just freeze the face for 2 minutes and you watch the sequence. And the sequence is first the child literally tries to reach and help you co-regulate, and then gets frustrated and may go into a tantrum. So in a sense, this child acted it out. And then there's a parallel of a educator from the UK contacted me, and she found out, she was very curious about what classrooms had the most children who were going into tantrum. And when did they go into tantrum? And she found out it had to do with the teacher's presence in the room, that the teacher had a bad day at home or had an argument before they went into the classroom. The teacher was like that mother. The face was flat, and the resources for a child who was reaching out to the teacher, like a parent, to co-regulate weren't there.
What I know you're speaking about in neuroception is I always think of, and forgive me if this is not a correct way of feeling into the word neuroception, but it's like sonar, where your entire being is now oriented to the world, and we are biased to survival.
Right.
And it's so sensory in nature, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I would say the problem, and I don't mean it's a problem, but I mean it as an intellectual problem, is we don't know all the pathways. We don't know the patterning. We know the patterning of intonation is powerful, and that's what SSP is. And we know that, tactile stimulation, and that goes into OT, sensory integration model. We know that there is touch that is welcoming, there's touch that's painful, and there's touch that's irritating. And we know that visual stimuli can do the same. It can be too busy or it can be too bright, and it triggers in our body defensiveness. But when we really don't have I would say, the full grammar of our body, because it's never been a high priority, I would say, for NIH funding. But the idea is, what can we learn about the cues that our body is, in a sense, requesting? And so I think SSP basically said there's a powerful one, and we can see it from birth. And I love to say that you can see how a mother calms the toddler and the father irritates the toddler or ramps them up. I would talk about being in airports and watching male toddlers go to the bathroom and come back screaming and crying, and the mother just kind of looks, touches, and says one word: "The baby's fine. The toddler's fine," and the father is clueless. But then fathers have been very good with their pets.
Mm.
And they use that a pet type voice, a petese, or melodic voice like a mother would. It's that we kind of tell fathers, you can't talk that way. You need to be a boundary setter. And the issue is boundary setting is not what infants need or young children. They need co-regulation. They need to be safe so that they can recruit. And I guess this is the point I want to make, is that you can't access those high levels of cortical function that make these wonderful cognitive decisions if you're in a state of fear or threat. You can't get there.
Brilliant.
Mm.
Leah, I know you have a brilliant question about top down, bottom up.
My face is uncontrollably smiling because you walked straight next to it. It was beautiful. Dr. Porges, it was stunning, and such a graspable way of thinking of the way that we interact with the world. And I'm wondering if you two can speak a little bit more to the differences between top-down versus bottom-up therapy processing, and why we might need both to interact with the world.
I'll start with that, Kim.
Okay.
You live in that world, but the issue is, and this is, I don't mean to be dismissive, but it's a pseudo question, because effective therapists, whether they are somatic oriented or cognitively oriented, are connective oriented. So they're engaging people. They understand making the individual feel safe with whatever metaphor they're using. I'm using the metaphor that their physiology now can support homeostatic function. But if you're a psychologist or another form of therapist, you would say, well, what does the face look like? What does the voice sound like? Because that's broadcasting those physiological states. You don't need electrodes on the heart to see the vagal activity occurring. You can hear it in the voice. And the laryngeal and pharyngeal nerves that control intonation are vagal nerves. So we evolve with this wonderful system that broadcasts our physiological state. And so the real, when we start talking bottom up and top down, let's just say that our physiology is in a state of threat, and that's being broadcast. It affects our brain, it affects how our body works. And if we're a therapist or through a parent or through a friend, we don't want those around us to be in chronic states of threat. We don't mind acute. That has certainly very powerful adaptive functions. But when it's chronic, people start using terms like anxiety disorders or highly mobilized, or using OT type terms, tightly wrapped. Basically, it's saying your sympathetic nervous system is, you're locked in a state of sympathetic neural tone. And I have a slide that I now use, which shows a bunch of reptiles around a card table playing cards. And basically I say, why should we expect, we don't expect reptiles to be social. Why would we expect individuals who are in a physiological state that is quite reptilian to be social? And in a sense, in the world of challenged children, that's exactly what's going on. And that's actually the portal in which people start using behavioral modification techniques to try to control the behaviors without, in a sense, respecting that the physiological state has a purpose, has a function.
I just have to soak that in for a minute and respond from, ironically, what I think is a neurobiological response, in that the top and the bottom of the brain are not separate. I say that with a little bit of irritation. And when I think about why perhaps the SSP was emphasized as a bottom-up approach, is because I think traditionally it was forgotten that neural platform was necessary to access the top. So there was this need for bridge building, I think. But just, when I read Dr. Porges's work, for example, I flap when I read about the nucleus accumbens, because the nucleus accumbens, which is part of the brainstem, is a place where the myelinated vagal nerve has its home. I think I'm correct on that.
This slight modification, nucleus ambiguous.
Ambiguous, yes, thank you. Thank you. That is a very important correction. But this is very critical because there's information fed from other parts of the brain into the nucleus ambiguous, for example, right?
Right. Well, it's a beautiful, I call it a phylogenetic journey to sociality. And along this journey, we got a tool. And the tool was what goes into the nucleus ambiguous and what comes out of it. And what happened is that, the transition between a reptilian autonomic nervous system and a mammalian one was that the cardioinhibitory, the fibers that slow the heart rate up, the vagal fibers moved, many of them moved from this area dorsal in the brainstem called the dorsal motor nucleus. They moved ventrally to the nucleus ambiguous. What makes that important is that that area of the nucleus ambiguous is the control of voice and facial expressivity. So that enabled us to cue and to receive cues. By the way, this would be, if Jane Eyre was around, she would obviously say, well, obviously, this is it, because it is that integration of that information that is the toolkit that enables us as social mammals to calm down. And so it's that toolkit that we have on board, and we access it through this social interaction. And this changes those physiological states. So we're focusing on the neuroception, but neuroception does something profound. It actually is reflexively shifting our physiological state. So it can take this frightened, agitated individual, and then with the cues of safety, suddenly the individual is calm. And we see this in the baby. So the safe and sound protocol. I want to make a couple comments on top down, bottom up. And SSP is really bottom up within the brain. So I have my hands in this triangular form, and in the apex of that inverted triangle is the brainstem. It's not very, in terms of cortical or neural material, it would be viewed as not as complex as this amazing network of patterns and pathways of the cortex. But it means that everything that goes in and out of our body, our nervous system, goes through that brainstem. So it's a portal, and that portal acts like gateways. So if the portal says you're under a state of threat, it's going to shunt information to areas that will support threat reactions. If you're in a state of safety, then you have this emergence of creativity that we think of as humanity. We think of it as aesthetics, creativity, spirituality. All these things are coming upward. I want to go back to one other comment, and that was, I like to reference a physiologist physician from Switzerland, Walter Hess, who in 1949 got the Nobel Prize. What for? For documenting that the brain regulated visceral organs and mapping the initial part of it. Basically saying there's only one nervous system. There's not a nervous system of the brain and one of the body. Now, I would say to you rhetorically, who's listened? Yeah. So, and many people who are online will have heard from even their physicians that when they have certain types of, quote, medically unexplained symptoms, that the physician will say it's all in your head. Well, nothing is all in your head. It's in your body. And so the respect is that we have both bottom-up systems and top-down, but the bottom-up systems are basically changing the portals of accessibility of the brain. And we need to respect that. And I think that's been greatly, let's see, those views have not really permeated medical school training.
That indulged my nerdy neurobiological brain. So I really am grateful for that wee indulgence there. I hope that was interesting to the listeners. And when I think about what you've just said about top down, bottom up interactions, how cognition, or what we think of as the top, is so highly influenced by how we process sensation, how we process our perception of danger, and how we integrate our emotional reactions to that. And what that does to how we think and how we experience the world. So it is an integrated whole.
I think I started playing with this notion that kind of based on the movie The Matrix, that we live in a different type of matrix, and the matrix is threat cues.
Yeah.
And so we don't even know who we are because we're so much in, we would call it toxic stress, but we're really defending all the time. And when we start to talk about like the pandemic and the political divisions, divisiveness, we start seeing that it feeds into a bodily state of being in a state of threat, and that interferes with our capacity to share with others, to be co-regulatory. And even this notion of vaccination versus not getting a vaccination. I was on a podcast yesterday and I basically said, it's like saying to people that it's my right to drive in the other direction on the highway. And no one would say that. We'd say you can't do that because you're going to hurt other people. Well, not getting vaccinated is not merely your personal right, it's the effect on others. It's like driving a car in the wrong direction. So we have to, in a sense, have a better understanding and respect for our own personal responsibilities of being part of a community.
There's that social connection.
That's who we are, Kim.
Right.
That's who you are. I mean, it's like, in a sense, when I saw you do the presentation in Denver in 2016, there was energy. There was this ball of energy coming out with passion, a passion for good, passion to connect. And you have that, it's in you. And so it gets expressed spontaneously. And when it's not in other people, they will even tell you why it's not in them. They're fearful. They're fearful. The wrappers are on. In their mind, they would like to take the wrappers off. But the body is like the history of people who have trauma. And that is, they want to have relationships. They want to be close to others. They want to give a hug. But when they get close to someone, their body says, too dangerous.
Yeah. I have this image when I talk about developmental trauma of these wire adults that are sitting in a protected position away from each other. And inside are two children reaching for each other. And that's how I think of the face-heart connection.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And what you're really saying is that the emergent property is to reach and have the reciprocity. But in a way, the maturational process, the culture, turns that off, or at least challenges it, makes it difficult for the body to reach out and feel that they can touch a trusted individual.
Kim, I know that image well. I've seen, I think, a sculpture of it at one point, and it is beautiful, beautiful. And you both have such an intimate tie to the Safe and Sound protocol. And Kim, I know you were going to share a couple of clips with us of your own sessions with a client and using the SSP. We're very excited to see that. I wondered, before we go there, if you'd speak to the connection between the SSP and your own mission, your mission to support the conscious evolution of the human spirit, and how the SSP has maybe played into that some.
So much of that answer has already been said in many ways. But I think when I think of the conscious evolution of the human spirit, and often in an interview, people say, well, what does that mean? And to me, my mission of you supporting the conscious evolution of the human spirit is every moment that we have increased awareness, more than the moment ago, we have consciously evolved. And that can only happen when we are connected. So for the SSP as a backdrop, as one backdrop, to facilitate that potential for connection through safety. And I think that any way that we as humans can find places where we feel safe, available, and connected, that's where the potential to take off that wrapping that Dr. Porges talks about is even remotely possible. And we feel who we are in those spaces.
I totally agree. What I like to say is that we can't be creative, we can't be loving, we can't be compassionate, we can't be spiritual unless we're safe. And the nature of safety to a human is through co-regulation, is in a sense inviting another person into our world that we feel safe enough with them. And that's why when you start talking about complex and developmental trauma, and especially when you start dealing with those who have been, let's say, products or processed by the foster child system, you realize that they have very little imagery, visualizations of what's positive.
Right.
And what I've seen, what I'd like to always say is that I've learned so much of what it is to be a human from the trauma community,
Yes.
because it's taught me what can be lost or what can be inaccessible, what can be difficult to access.
Yes.
But the survivors never give up the hope of having that visualization of being safe in the arms of another.
I have a story that was a game changer for me of exactly what you're speaking about, Dr. Porges. And I was working in the Middle East and I found myself in a bomb shelter during an air raid. And this little girl who comes from central Canada, Winnipeg, had never been in a bomb shelter during an air raid. And in this place of terror, I was with this mom and her 3 kids. And in this bomb shelter where you could hear in the distance what my imagination was imagining, this mom read bedtime stories to her 3 kids. And those 3 kids could have been at home in their bed. They were so co-regulated in danger that for the first time I realized that we really, really do need each other in order to feel safe, and that the environment is a variable, but in that context, the relationship superseded the environment.
What you're describing is really giving hints of the hierarchy or the priority of our nervous system. So the priority says, if I get cues of safety, I am now no longer in a state of threat. In a sense that it's a polyvagal hierarchy, that when I get this newer system of safety in place, I can deal with a lot of challenge. If I don't have that on, I'm vulnerable. I'm a reptile. I'm going to be reactive. I'm going to be self-serving, self-protective, and I will not be generous or caring because I have to survive. And the mother was really carrying this, literally a blanket of love and protection that enabled the children's wrappers to open up and they could sleep. And sleep is really another one of these flags to tell us whether our homeostatic systems are working. And because you start again in the clinical world, sleep disorders pop up all the time. And why? Because the body can't give up its vigilance.
No.
It has to be aware of that potential intruder that hasn't come yet, but may come soon.
I read in my nerdy little reading recently that the stapedius muscle is, which is it's the tiniest muscle in the body, is one of the only muscles, or it is 80% active during REM. Even in REM, when we are atonic, our stapedius muscle is still there working.
Yeah, actually, that may be developmental because the types of differentiation of sleep state. But the part is, think about it, we're reliving our vigilance.
Yes. Oh,
And so when the stapedius muscle, what we want the stapedius to do, when it's tense, it actually restricts the range of acoustic signals that we process efficiently, and it focuses on human voice. So we, in a sense, paradoxically want tension on that muscle, because
yes.
what it's doing is tightening up our eardrum, and the low frequency sounds bounce off. And of course, when we talk about the SSP and the positive impact of it, people can deal with noisy environments better, and they can hear human voice in noisy environments better. And that's because the system now, once they socially engage, that eardrum tightens up and starts blocking those low frequency sounds, and we no longer are hypervigilant.
It's so cool.
That is so cool.
It all fits, you know, so it's like it fits. And that is even this on this evolutionary journey, the middle ear bones broke off the jaw. So what makes mammals different than reptiles in the fossil record is that the middle ear bones are broken off. And those middle ear bones are the ones controlled by the stapedius and the tensor tympani, the two smallest muscles of the body. And they're linked to the facial nerve and to the trigeminal, so facial expressivity and sucking and ingestion. The nifty thing also for your neuroscience craving for today is that the suck, swallow, breathe reflex, or not reflex, circuit, is the social engagement system.
The circuit, yeah.
Yeah. So when you start looking developmentally, as OTs do with infants where sucking may not be well developed, those are really precursors or antecedent conditions of having social problems later in life. So because it's the same circuit. And think about what we do as quasi-mature adults. We use ingestion and as a mode of creating social interactions. So we say, let's go out for a drink, let's go out for dinner. And it's the ingestive act, which is stimulating that circuit.
Wow.
Eating and feeding matters.
And think in terms about, again, trauma histories, where people may end up having eating disorders, or let's say people with eating disorders may have a trauma history.
Yes.
And that eating disorder is really a valiant attempt, usually, to use ingestion to regulate their physiology because the social behavior is threatening and frightening to them.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
So good. Kim, I'm wondering as you're pulling up that video, what a beautiful representation of how much responsibility we have as attachment figures to young ones in your example with the mom. I'm just thinking about how much responsibility we carry as attachment figures. And thank you for sharing that. And Dr. Porges, thank you for your response and all of your insight. Those are beautiful.
I have vulnerably a video to share with you for your comments. And before we begin, I want to say, as I introduce you to Noah, who is 11, and Hillary, who is his mom, that we created this video not because Noah has any diagnosis. This is looking at the impact of the SSP, I think, on humanity. But there is so much, I think, to see in this video. So I'm eager for your reflections, for your comments, and I've got it broken up into 4 different sections. Noah's report of his experience in life with respect to sound, a segment of him listening, and a pre-test and a post-test of him in his postural system. So it'll be very interesting, I think, for you all to see. So welcome, Hillary and Noah.
All righty. So the first thing I want to know is, are you ever sensitive to sound?
Yes.
What kind of sounds would you be
Kind
sensitive
of,
to?
Well, when me and my mom, when we're in the car, we listen to like the radio stations and they go like this weird electric kind of, you know? You remember that? Like those
Speak more
electric,
about it.
the electric ones, it's kind of radio station, and then it doesn't, my ears don't like it.
Okay. And so when you say your ears don't like it, does it hurt?
No, I just like, it just kind of zones me out from everything else and then only focuses on that, my ears, and I don't like that.
That's such an extraordinary description. That's an incredible description. When you're in class at school, do you ever notice other kids talking, or do noises ever bother you in that location?
Like in school?
Yeah.
If it's like people screaming, yes, but if they're just talking, I'm used to that because my friends talk a lot.
That's really interesting. Now back to the electrical music. I want to know a little bit more about that music. Is it the frequency of the sound, do you think?
I don't know. It's just
Do you, when you say electric, do you mean?
I am attuned to Leah, who is giving me this cue. And what I want to say is my volume is as loud as it can be. But I will paraphrase for you the depth of description that someone who is 11 can give to sound. And he's about to say here that it sounds like glass breaking, electrical sounds, and that all the sounds come together as a whole. It is such a sophisticated explanation of how he is sensing in to the sensory systems of sound. And I'm just curious what you see in the body, what you see as he talks about these experiences that he has of listening just to sound in everyday life.
Well, first of all, you can see in him that he is being witnessed. And again, this is part of what we haven't brought into our discussion, and that is that we tend as a species, as a culture, to be horrible witnesses of others. And you can see Kim's artful way of engaging and, in a sense, interacting and witnessing his experience. And it's drawing out of him, and you're seeing, in a sense, a neural in polyvagal terms, I would say, a neural exercise of co-regulation. So you're acknowledging his presence, you're allowing him to express himself, and that is a therapeutic exercise in itself.
I also love how his mom is so present.
Yeah.
Like, just look at her body, look at her orientation. There's such a distinct grounding rod, so to speak, in her presence as he tells his story.
As you're talking, I'm looking at their hands. They're doing the same thing with their hands. I just noticed that. So she obviously is a model for him as a co-regulator.
And there's a point here.
Sort of the heavy metal kind of rock? No.
She becomes curious, but not judgmental, or doesn't try to make the story finished for him.
Yeah. Well, she's a good witness, and she's really present.
There are times I feel like he notices that this conversation is revealing his sensitivity. And I detect little bits of, I don't want to use the word shame because it's too strong, right? But noticing or feeling like that's not okay.
Well, you would see that in the upper part of his face, which you can see is quite flat for that age child. And that's what I want to look at, what happens over the next videos, because remember, he is seeing a clinician, he's seeing you. And that's evaluative in itself. And so he hasn't gotten, in a sense, the grade from the evaluation yet.
Right. And all therapists need to keep that in mind. right? The nature of the challenge. Now, just a moment of pause here. When you in the audience have the recording, you will have the original video. So the volume will be better when you listen to it next, when you listen to the recording.
And maybe just a lot of sounds made into one sound.
Do you ever notice when you're watching a movie, the sounds in the movie as being, I don't know, adding to the scariness or adding to the,
Yeah.
yeah?
Yeah, if like it's kind of the scenes. If they didn't have the music, the movie wouldn't be the same.
So you are very sensitive to sound, like sensitive as in tuned in, oriented
Yeah,
to it.
I really like sound.
Very cool.
So, Kim, that's a beautiful way of labeling someone as being hypersensitive without a negative attribute.
Bringing to his attention, but making it feel that it's okay and gifted.
Okay, so when you just flash this picture up, look at the upper part of the face. Yes, and that's the orbital muscle around the eye called the orbicularis oculi, and that the branch of the facial nerve going to that muscle is very close to the branch going to the middle ear muscles, the stapedius. So you literally can see the SSP working by looking at that muscle.
I know I almost jumped out of my skin when I put the headphones on and this shot came on. Look at
Yeah.
my eyebrows are up there too. I'm like,
Yeah.
look at this.
Yeah.
It's orienting.
Yeah.
And this awakening of that aspect. And this is the first 2 seconds of the music being presented in his ears.
Wow. Wow.
So I wanted to let you see what happens in a little brief cut up pieces of his time listening.
Okay, I saw your eyes open a little wider. All right.
I also love how his eyes start searching.
Yeah.
Right? They're looking.
So the original title, the first polyvagal paper, was Orienting in a Defensive World, our evolutionary modifications of our, I don't know, reptilian heritage or something of that order. But the point was orienting in a defensive world. We have to be safe enough to be able to explore the world. That's what he's starting to do.
Yeah. And if you can reflect back without looking back at the moment before in the center, kind of in a more protected, oriented space of his posture, his eyes were very forward as he was speaking. And I call it unhooking the eyes.
Can you hear it?
You're gonna kind of hear like everything is.
He's describing it. He says it sounds like, can't quite hear it, but he's describing the music, and I it's soft and he's attuned to it.
Yeah.
Kind of like that.
Yep. It's very quiet.
Now I notice here his mouth. My perception is that this is a couple minutes in, is that there's more activation. I don't know if it's the right word to call it tone. We always argue about the word tone in my profession, but more action in the lower part of the face as well as the eyes.
Well, the lower part of the face is confusing because it can also be a tool of aggression, like biting. So I focus on the upper part of the face. And if you look at children on spectrum, most of the muscle tone is lower part of the face because it has more voluntary components to it. So if you say to a person on spectrum, smile, it's all going to be down here. If you talk to, let's say, a neurotypical, and you can see they'll be spontaneous. It's less voluntary control and much more spontaneity in the upper part of the face.
Cool.
It looks really beatific, so it's like it just looks really sweet.
Yes. So we decide I bring out something to do. And it's interesting, I chose parallel here, but these two are collaborative. You know, they could easily be doing a collaborative task. He starts bopping a little bit.
That's exactly what I'm gonna do. Put that right.
So now I start to tune in on posture, which I've noticed all along. And I want to see if I can create a shift there. It does all kinds of things.
Okay, I'm gonna change this position. I'm gonna put it right there.
Hmm.
And here is where I got excited and couldn't wait to ask you a question. You talk in your paper, in your chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Compassion Science about vocalization, breath, and posture. And in every single one of my cases, what I see is a shift in posture.
Yeah, I'm going to, in that chapter, it was really about the portals into the social engagement system, but you're alluding to something else, which I will talk about.
Okay.
And that is we're working with Parkinson's now. We're doing some feasibility pilot studies. And what's very interesting with Parkinson's is that just like this child, that when they put the headset on, their faces come back almost immediately. And their bodies start to straighten up, which is what you're really alluding to. However, with Parkinson's, the body wants to curl again. So it gets into this true battle of what I would call the social engagement system versus a sympathetic hyper muscle tone pulling inward. And it's taking, actually, there are a couple pilot subjects now, and I'm talking to a group in Germany to do a clinical trial, but it takes a lot of slow presentations of the SSP because the body has to become reassured that it's not going to get destabilized by going back to its upright position. But it's quite interesting. They can maybe handle, at times less than a minute, and the body says too much for me because it gets into this literally a battle. So the model, and this is what I'm working on now, is that many of the symptoms of chronic diseases are what I call piggybacked on the fact that our autonomic nervous system moves into a state of threat with these diseases, but it's not part of the disease. It's our reaction to having the disease on a biological level. It's not a cognitive level that I'm fearful I have the disease and everything comes out. The body has detected it as a threat. And now we have to convince the body to give up the fight.
Wow. I also see a shift in breath.
Yeah, you also will see the shoulders and the thorax opening up. Yep. And remember, it's just like the Parkinson's is your model because the body is coming inward. And that dystonia is what you're fighting against. So when we're in defense, again, this becomes kind of a metaphor. That's our ventral side is our side of protection. And those of you who work with kids on spectrum, what do the kids do? They do this and they curl inward on their chest. And that, of course, will inhibit being able to have a deep breath. But when we're safe, our ventral side opens up. And that's what you're seeing as more formed, deeper breaths, more systematic. And functionally, that's more efficient oxygenization. We're just in supporting our health. But when we're in states of defense, we're protecting our body from being injured.
There's one more piece that I want to add to the interest of that thought process is that what we think about in inner core activation of
Mm.
postural activation is the diaphragm.
Yeah.
That when that diaphragm has, and this is the work of my friend Shelley Mannell and Julie Wiebe, that when the diaphragm has greater expansiveness to meet that pelvic floor, you've got more stability in your trunk. And
Yeah.
so when you can breathe, you can also sit.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
there's circular playoffs, I think, that happen in this.
Yeah,
Natural.
and we have to also realize that the pelvic floor is a diaphragm as well. And that's, of course, very much related to balance, which is going to be related to posture. And we have to also acknowledge that as if we traumatize the physiology, let's say from surgery or anesthesia,
Yeah.
the diaphragm stops working. It needs to be, in a sense, reinformed that it's safe enough to take those deep breaths.
Brilliant. Well, I don't know about you listeners, but 25 million different kids just came into my head as he said that.
Yeah.
So it progresses from here in some cool ways. And by the way, on his left wrist there, I have an empatica.
Mm.
So I play with it to look at the heart rate variability and the galvanic skin response. And when I make this video more sophisticated in the future, I have his readout, and there was a really beautiful shift in his heart rate variability about this time in the listening process.
Yeah, well, that's basically saying that it's functioning like a non-invasive acoustic vagal nerve stimulator. It's calming him down, and it's being reflected in the heart rate variability.
Yep. Very cool.
Sorry, Noah, if a little bit of movement interrupts the coloring.
So here's another question I have for you that I have on my list. How does the vestibular system interface here, the polyvagal?
Okay,
Here.
first of all, it does, but the second point is it's not really what I know that much about, but we do know that the vestibular system can trigger nausea. So we know that it can affect the subdiaphragmatic vagus. And so we know there's a interaction, at least on a defensive mode. So, and again, when people lose balance and there's this very rapid autonomic shift that they have to try to stabilize, but it's not the focus of what I've done in my life, but I'm not discounting its value. It's just not what I've done.
So what I'm thinking, if you can indulge me in my little making up stories in my head, is that the dorsal vagal, because you called it the subdiaphragmatic, that's the unmyelinated aspect. For some of our clients who might be so challenged in how they put together vestibular input into their nervous system, that maybe that is the way they're going to register it first.
Yeah,
right.
I would tend to agree. I think it's a viable explanation.
Okay. And often we occupational therapists are really space holders for vestibular input.
Yeah, I want to add something to that, because one of the things I do virtually every morning is oscillatory tilts on an inversion table. And from an OT perspective, that would be vestibular. From a polyvagal perspective, it's baroreceptors. It's blood pressure feedback. It's a vagal challenge, a vagal stimulation. If I were doing more rotation, and I have a BOSU, which is inverted, it's half of a big ball and you kind of balance on it. In the inverted one, that's the pelvic floor type exercise. That's truly vestibular. But I think, again, there's this relationship between blood pressure regulation, posture shifts, as well, and that it's not always vestibular, but vestibular is important.
But when I think about what therapists often think about baroreceptors, and is that there is this perception that baroreceptors are only activated in the neck if I'm actually fully upside down. Am I correct in my assumption that every movement of my neck will have impact to some degree on my baroreceptors?
Well, and especially if it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon and you start rubbing your neck, that's what you're doing. Because there are vagal inputs or vagal pathways involved in that. So rocking, if we think about different types of rocking that would be used to calm a baby, is a head to toe more calming, or is a lateral movement more calming? And that's one way you separate whether it's a vestibular or a baroreceptor. And my view has been, since vagal centric in my thinking, has been head to toe. And if you like kind of ride the waves on a raft, do you want to be head to toe or do you want to be sideways? It's the same thing with roller coasters. I like the straight drop, used to like, I haven't been on them in a while, but when our kids were younger, I was on every ride with them. I didn't like the ones that were flying all over the place, but I liked the massive drops because they were clear visceral reactions with great predictability. And I viewed them literally as a neural exercise. And I was trying to map in my mind, what's this experience? Because you're not going to jump out of a 10-story building, but you can have the same literally visceral response within a safe or relatively safe environment.
I know the same thing happens to me even in virtual reality, which is another interesting. You're much braver than I, let me say.
Well, we're naive. The other part is optokinetic. So you can spin like a drum around the person's eyes. You're not moving, but the body feels like it's moving. That creates nausea.
Yes.
And that gets into that vagal system.
I hope whether you're a counselor or an occupational therapist or whatever you're bringing to this work today, that this integrates some of it for you. To me, I call this translating it into the body.
Sorry if it does.
Oh, you should look at my mom's coloring.
Social engagement.
The posture is different right now.
Mm-hmm.
He's like running the show at the moment.
So cool. It's like, I feel my body.
Increased heat.
So I just said to his mom, do you feel increased heat? Because I'm getting hot, which is really, and I'm not doing anything.
Yeah. Yeah. You
Yeah.
notice that?
Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah.
Why do you think so?
I don't know.
Yeah, for some reason I have this weird thing for my body. I get really hot, like
And so he's describing that he gets hot. And what was interesting is all three of us got hot. And I just relished in that connection, even at an energetic level. So I wanted to leave that in this clip as an amazing observation.
my ears get hot, just one of my thumbs get hot.
But it's a degree of self-awareness and embodiment. That's how our body works. When our body is in a state of threat and defense, even the peripheral vasculature will clamp down.
For sure. And think of the interoception to be that connected, to have that awareness at a sophisticated level like this.
Well, Kim, you mentioned that it was a parallel activity, and then he said, oh, you should see my mom's, and he was pulling in the social engagement.
And now
that
look at this.
the support away, it's sustained. See?
He's shifting off the midline. He's got more activation through his hips. I'm just like, wow. Crossing midline, rotation in his trunk.
Yeah. Think about the rigidity of the body when it's in a state of defense, and he's basically giving up one of those wrappers, and he's showing this mobility.
Well, I feel like it's what you're saying is he's letting us see what's there.
Yeah.
Right? And what is so important for, I think, my OT colleagues is we make decisions about kids' postural systems, neurological systems based on these kinds of assessments. And what we might really be evaluating is their neuroception of danger.
Yeah. That's Kim, it's a very important point you're bringing up, and that is when you see things as being state dependent versus being a trait feature. When they're state dependent, they're really dependent upon a physiological state. And if you shift that physiological state, you get a different presentation.
Yes.
And that's what you're doing.
So I know that we like in my profession, evidence-based, how do I measure things? So I'm vulnerably showing you the pretest. Now this part I did before he listened. So I want you to just look at his body move.
And now bring your knees up to your chest. And put your arms across your knees. Maybe underneath. Oh,
I said, oops, nope, I did that wrong.
Lift up your head.
Look at the struggle here.
1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 4, 1,000, 5, 1,000, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Sternocleidomastoid shoulders, hold my breath.
Okay, now go on your hands and knees. Now that you're here, I'm going to move.
You can see the hyperextensibility in his elbows,
Mhm.
how around his back is his shoulder blades are hanging off his trunk a wee bit. He keeps his knees close together. There's a lot of compensatory biomechanical strategies here to stay up against gravity.
Your head.
And then he collapses in his upper trunk.
Move your head. Let me do all the work.
And it's got a little staccato to it. Ratchety is what I describe that as.
Okay.
I can't wait for you to see it after
Turn your head that way.
listening.
And turn your head that way. Okay. Now can you lie down on your tummy?
Now, Dr. Ayers, who was my teacher, she said, never do supine flexion and prone extension back to back. So I just don't.
And bring your arms up overhead like you're going to be Superman.
My instructions.
So that's it. And so lift your arms up and your legs up. And now look.
Now he has to bend his
And
knees.
see if you can keep your knees straight.
The knees straight.
Yep.
You mean like
Yep.
just like that?
See if you can keep. Yeah, perfect. Keep your whole. And can you count out loud?
1,
What?
3, 4, 5, 6,
Hands fisted.
7, 8, 9, 10.
Perfect.
Lots of extension in his lumbar spine. Look at here.
And I want your mom to see if the.
Okay, just look at the difference in the
Wow.
postural system. Isn't it incredible?
Yeah.
From pre-test to post-test. You can see relax in the shoulders, more connection between the rib cage and the pelvis, softness in his knees in the post-test. Big difference.
difference here. See that?
Yes.
Your whole body is much more. Yeah. Whew. So now, can you lie on your back again?
Look at the speed of the movement.
Come a little bit more towards me and cross your arms across your chest.
Okay, this is
Lift
so
up your
fun.
legs towards your tummy. Yep. And now lift your head. Now, what do you notice?
Oh my gosh, it's so much easier.
He said, oh my gosh, it's so much easier.
Incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot easier.
It's
You didn't
way
cross your
easier.
ankles this time. You're not pointing your toes. Wow, that's a significant difference.
It's much easier. My neck is like.
Yeah.
He said it 3 times.
Hmm.
Right? It's so much easier.
Okay, now come back on your hands and knees. Look at the speed of the movement. And face me, please. Thank you, love. Okay. And I'm going to move your head, okay?
And what I notice here is more ease of moving the head. Just less resistance and defense.
And now come onto your toe.
But I decide I'm greedy because I wanted more out of the trunk. And so I tried to with the headphones on,
Like you're gonna do
with
this
back
one.
with some SSP while
And
listening
lift your elbows up off the ground. Which way?
and look at the
Look up
difference.
at me. Look at the difference. Amazing.
So I hope that that gave folks a wee glimpse into, other things you can look for in the body, not just in social engagement regulation. Right?
Thank you for sharing all of that, Kim.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you for watching it.
So the quick take home for me is that when you calm the body, it's part of this notion that when we're dealing with skeletal motor systems, that when we have that social engagement system on board, it now becomes not only more playful, but it keeps the body from going into a type of tonicity, muscle tonicity, that is reserved for being in aggression or defense.
Beautiful. Just for commentary here, his listening duration in that particular example was about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
It wasn't very long. And you saw the change immediately when you put it on his head.
And was it the beginning of core, Kim, or did you pick a particular section within
It
the
was
core?
core that I used. Yeah.
Oh.
SSP core child.
I wondered, during one of your longer recordings, I wrote a quote down that struck me in the middle of my face. It's you said, if learning to be in relationship is the path to learning to be in yourself, you can't just listen by yourself and get there. In regards to the SSP, and I'm wondering if you two would be able to willing to explore that notion a little bit more in this, what it means to listen to the SSP alongside another.
Well, I know that I made that quote after I attended the Integrated Listening Systems cohort participation, where we were listening together as a group. And I've used the SSP on myself individually numerous times. And there was a remarkable difference for me, even on screen, with others who were there to be with me. And so that's where I knew it as a concept, but the experience made me know it in my body.
What's interesting, Kim, is when I started to develop this in my laboratory, we were doing it in cohorts of 4 kids. And what was interesting was to watch the spontaneous social interaction. And these were kids on spectrum. I mean, they weren't just on low end of spectrum, they were really on spectrum. And you could start seeing facial expressivity, spontaneity of interaction, and a degree of co-regulation. And they were also in the room, not just by themselves, but with their parents or caregiver. And it created a type of social support system for the experience. However, as I started to develop this, delivery in groups is more difficult to structure and more difficult even for, let's say, peer-reviewed research journals, which are all about an external something coming into the system and seeing if you get something out, as opposed to, can you create the context that facilitates that internal system to enable it to process that external cues, let's say, more potently or more efficiently. So I think there's room for both. And I think what we're also learning during the pandemic, with so many people delivering it in a virtual world, and often delivering it, it's people are having a degree of co-regulation with others to a different level than they had when they were, in a sense, in the clinic, given the headset, and the therapist may or may not have even stayed in the room. So when they're being monitored in a virtual space, they're there, and I think there are benefits. I think there's a lot of exploration that needs to be done, and I think part of it has to do with the specific therapist and how they relate to their clients. Um, I like the idea of, I mean, what you said, I wouldn't discount, is what I'm trying to tell you. I wouldn't exclude people using it by themselves or just one, but I would say that you could amplify the effectiveness of this with other cues of co-regulation. And for those of us who have like participated in things like drum circles in your life, and where you see others, you don't know them. But one thing you experience, and that is when you're finished with the session, you think you know them. And I'm sure listening to the SSP in a group does the same thing. You see the faces, and your body now reinterprets them as safe, friendly people that you'd like to get to know.
I mean, I can feel that as a grading of, I want to use the word affiliation.
Yeah.
Right? That
I think so. I mean, what we're doing, and let me share this with not just you, but with all of us, and that is we're uncovering what it is to be a human. So this connectedness, the use of intonation, SSP takes a principle that intonation of vocalizations is a cue that our bodies cannot refuse. It has to kind of accept it. But if our physiology carries with it a history of injury or trauma, being accessible can be traumatic or can be a problem. But when we are with another, we have a greater range of what we can tolerate. And so we're more likely to experience it and get a better benefit of it. But the part that I learned, and this was my own personal journey, my personal journey was that these are the cues that a nervous system has to accept. It was like, I called it kind of a stealth intervention. You don't have to know about it, you just have to listen to it, and suddenly things will change. And it's from the trauma world that I learned that becoming accessible, being a sense becoming open, is a powerful cue to become defensive if you carry with you a trauma history. And that, to me, changed how I approach things. And I was much more interested in what was going on inside that person while they were listening. And so I felt that what SSP providers needed to develop was a skill set to see the physiological shifts, the state shifts in face and voice. They didn't need to put electrodes on the individuals, but they need to know the cues that were manifested. Could be posture, could be shoulders, could be tension in the arms. You can see it. And when you become attuned to this, you know when a person is struggling, and that's when you stop. You don't want this system, you don't want the nervous system to fight with getting these cues. You want it to flourish with the cues, and if it's too much, you stop and allow the nervous system to rebalance itself.
one of the things that you're speaking about here is what Leah talked about yesterday with me, is called tracking.
Yeah.
Tracking all of those micro and macro expressions in the face and in the body. And I believe that we as attuners therapeutically can respond to those things in sophisticated ways that add the layering or the scaffolding into our therapeutic process.
Now, I think what you're describing is the most important attribute that I'm going to use the term polyvagal informed therapist would have, and that would be this deep respect for the other person's physiological state, and to be aware of that. And part of the training of being a good therapist is that awareness, because what you're doing is witnessing and respecting your client. If you let those cues go by, then you're sending a different set of cues to the client, and that is you're not interested and they're not being witnessed.
And what a beautiful implicit level we can tune into to bring to the conscious and allow it to become an embodied experience, both from a bottom up, I'm feeling it, but now that I know that I'm feeling it, I can
Mhm.
feel into it even more.
Yeah. So Leah, what I think, and this is part of the journey of life, the journey of development, the journey of healing, is to become re-embodied. And that is to be know we're in our body, respect and to honor what our body's trying to tell us, because it's always trying to help us.
It's so good. We have about 4-ish minutes left. So I'm wondering, Kim or Dr. Porges, if you have any last thoughts that are burning within you that you would like to share or explore together.
Well, I just want to express my gratitude and tell you that even though I am in a ventral vagal state, I have so much excitement. There has to be some sympathetic in there too.
Well, that's play. I mean, you're a playful person. So when we have this hybrid state of sympathetic excitation, but it's constrained by our social engagement system, we're playful, we're exuberant. It gives us the energy. If we took off that social engagement system, we're now vulnerable to be aggressive and to fight. But you're doing the right thing. And that's why a lot of therapists involve movement in their therapies, because movement enables that physiology to be contained with the social engagement system. And in fact, with people, the challenge, of course, for many therapists is that their clients can't sit still.
Right.
It's a state regulation issue. Now, the beauty of an understanding of that is that you can create these hybrid situations of engaging the social engagement system with SSP, with facial expressivity, with gesture, while moving. And of course, the dance movement therapists have known this all along.
So Unite, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to have this conversation.
Yeah, of course. I want to mention something. So in the background, I'm working with Unite to develop a heart rate monitor that can be used within these clinical settings that will measure vagal regulation of the heart, including a new variable that I have developed called vagal efficiency, which is really it basically tells you how much of your heart rate changes are being driven by the ventral vagus. And that's what we're talking about, that hybrid state, as opposed to, I have heart rate changes, I have vagal tone, but they're not integrated and regulated. So we'll have this variable, we're working on this, and hopefully the product will be available, certainly within the next year.
Dr. Porges, thank you for your lifelong dedication to serving all of us on the planet.
Well, Kim, as one person talking to another person who has lived a life of passion and exploration, we're doing what's in us. And that's where the reward and the reinforcement comes from, this ability to express our desires to be helpful. And it's not like anything in return is what we want, other than that we're helpful. That's our journey. And I feel, actually, what I started to use, a word that I seldom had used before, I start to, in a sense, understand what gratitude means. And that gratitude is the ability to express yourself in a positive way. And that is, you really have a sense of gratitude when you're able to do that. And that's your world as well. So I share that with you, and I'm very appreciative of your insights. And basically, your love of humanity. I mean, that's powerful. And we need to be in environments where expressing that is welcomed.
Wow. Thank you.
Thank you so much. As our time winds down, I just want to offer, you guys have already done it, offering this gratitude. Thank you for sharing your energy and for embodying you to what it means to build a bridge between the communities. And you live it, and it's an example that you're sharing. We all follow it. It's beautiful. You certainly walk the walk.
Thank you.
Listeners, in keeping with our intention, And for those that are listening, you may be interested in engaging more deeply with Kim and Dr. Porges and what they have to offer. We're offering a bundle that's combining the Safe and Sound protocol, what you've heard here a lot today, with one of Kim's courses called Trauma Sensitive Practice. You can learn more about this by visiting our website. But with that, I just want to thank you again, both, and thank you all for listening and being present with us and giving us your energy. And I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day. And thank you, guys, again to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.